Welcome everyone to the next episode of our second season of People Keeping It Sacred, highlighting people who are keeping it sacred in the world. I'm Rabbi Heather Miller, founder of Keeping It Sacred, and I'm thrilled to introduce you to today's guest, the Reverend Mike Kinman. Reverend Kinman, he and him, is a follower of Jesus, spouse, parent, Episcopal priest, and the 10th rector of All Saints Church in Pasadena. Prior to All Saints, he also served as the Dean of Christ Church Cathedral in St. Louis, and there he had a particular interest in the cathedral's role in dismantling systemic misogyny and homophobia and promoting racial and economic reconciliation in St. Louis. With Christ Church Cathedral, he was active in the new civil rights movement that was ignited in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri. He also serves on the Global Advisory Council of Thistle Farms. I can't wait to hear more about Thistle Farms and all about what you're doing. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you so much. It is great to be here.
I'm so glad to have you here. And ever since you came back, you made your triumphant climb back to California in 2016 when you came back to All Saints Church in Pasadena. I know that you came from Dodger Town. I wanted to know a little bit about what was that experience like coming back to your hometown? I mean,
well, and it wasn't strictly my home. I actually was born in Santa Clara, California, and then my parents moved to Tucson, Arizona, and it was Tucson where I grew up. But my mom's family was all over the LA area, and I always felt this huge connection to LA. I probably spent most of my life wishing I lived in Los Angeles instead of Tucson, although Tucson was pretty good. And then I went off to college in Columbia, Missouri, and spent most of the next 20 plus years in Missouri, which was a place I never thought I would be. And it was a wonderful place with its own unique challenges, just like LA, just like everywhere else has its own unique challenges. And it was so interesting, though. I was really surprised when All Saints reached out to me and said they were interested in entering into discernment about being rector. And I remember when they flew my wife, Robin, and I out here for an interview, and I got off the plane and sort of stepped outside the airport, and it just felt like home. And we walked over to a cafe over on Colorado, and we were sitting and having a cup of coffee. And I stopped for a second and I listened, and I could hear just within earshot 5 different languages being spoken. And that's where it was like, oh, this is where I need to be, because there was just such amazing, beautiful diversity just everywhere you went. And coming from St. Louis, which is just statistically one of the most segregated cities in America, it's not like only English was spoken in St. Louis or there was only sort of one kind of person. It's just like the intermixing isn't there. And to me, that's beloved community. That's the realm of God. Is that happening? And so I thought, wow, it really, places like Los Angeles are uniquely amazing places to be in community.
That's that beloved community that King talks about, right? Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yeah, the King, it came, I mean, I think it was, W.B. Du Bois and Howard Thurman and King. And it's this idea that community, the truest form of it is based, first of all, on the belief that every person is created in the image of God and is beloved beyond measure. And that's how we can live with each other, is every interaction we can recognize that
is so big on universal ideals and universalism and that idea. But it's so clear that especially you as the leader, like really come through the lens so clearly through a Christian lens. Mm-hmm. And it's, for some people that might be off-putting because people might wonder like, oh, it's very particularistic. People might call it parochial, but the way that you do it is not in a way that's exclusionary. And I think it's such a fine balance. And it's an ideal that I hope and strive for as a rabbi, that yes, I love my tradition so much. And I so clearly see the world through this lens. And that means that I love beyond that particularity as well. It's like the lens through which I see the world. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about how you understand the relationship between your particular lens, but then also these affirmative statements and the affirmative way that you live around beloved community, as you just articulated as well. What's the relationship between those?
Yeah, and I'm sort of going to have to go back a ways for that. And it really is how I grew up. And so as I grew up in Tucson and grew up going to an Episcopal church. My dad grew up my dad's British, and he grew up in England going to the Church of England. My mom was nominally Episcopalian. And then around the time I was in fourth grade, my mom joined a church that when I was in Missouri, no one had ever heard of. And in California, everyone has heard of. It's called Self-Realization Fellowship. Right. And so she joined SRF, and I was right around in fourth grade. But the great thing, and my parents were married 53, 54 years. And for most of that marriage, my mom was a strong devotee at SRF, and my dad ended up becoming ordained as a deacon in the Episcopal Church. And they were just so clear that each had found the path that was right for them. And that it was not about, well, for me to be right, you have to be wrong. It was, how can we love and support each other and recognize that this is actually something that will make our marriage stronger, because we actually get to draw on these two traditions. And I married, when Robin and I got married, Robin's mother is Episcopalian and her basically father is Jewish. And again, it's sort of that mutuality, and it's not a zero-sum game. It's just it's a multiplier. I had I'll probably bounce around a little bit here. I had in St. Louis a wonderful colleague that you may know of, Rabbi Susan Talvey, yes, from Central Reform Congregation, and I adore Susan. And Susan would come to Christ Church Cathedral, and like Robin and I would love going to Central Reform. And part of what we would talk about is, and she would say that she's like, when I come to Christ Church Cathedral, don't feel you have to be apologetic about your Christianity or right, be any less Christian or soften things because you're worried about offending me. And it's like, yeah, when I showed up at Central Reform, they didn't feel a need to insert a reading from the Gospel of Luke just because I was there. I wanted them to live into the most loving depths of their Judaism, and she wanted us to live into the most loving depths of our Christianity. And we realized that when we did, that it was amazing. What I found in Ferguson was it didn't matter what faith you were. It didn't matter what denomination you were. It didn't even matter if you claimed a faith. It was who showed up. Yeah,
different ways that faith was there. And I also came from an interfaith family. I don't know if you knew that, but my dad's Unitarian. So now, and my mom is Reformed Jewish, she was fourth generation, I'm fifth generation Reformed Jewish. And just that idea that, we are a family, we love each other, and we can each have our own rituals that, someone's always going to be explaining ritual to you and sharing with you what it means to them. Yeah. And you'll get different answers from different people because people are making meaning of it. And the point isn't so much about which specific tradition or how things fit together. It's just more about that every tradition, that life is richer when you can take a moment to pause and appreciate. And if you can do that together, anywhere where there's a community that's appreciating life, that's lifting up human dignity, like you said in Ferguson, that's your community. Those are your people, right? That's how I feel too. Those are my people. How do you keep your understanding of Jesus and those amazing values of love at the center? How does that work for you?
It works incredibly imperfectly. But part of what happened when I first got here, because I have this understanding of Jesus that has sort of been shaped by me throughout my life. And, so I come here and I just start talking about Jesus a lot, and my predecessors talked about Jesus, but what I realized was I was getting all of a sudden a huge amount of pushback. And I think, first of all, it actually is important to note that we just had the Trump election. And so in addition to who's this new guy after 24 years of Ed Bacon, which had been just transformational leadership for this community, now everything's changing and we don't know what end is up, because it's what is happening to the country and what is happening to this church. And here's this guy who is talking about Jesus in a very specific way that's different. And also, Ed and I are different generationally. And
Right.
I mean, Ed's a boomer, and I'm a Gen Xer who has been much more shaped by the generations younger than me from places like Ferguson than I have by older. And so we come across very differently. And it's a large, it's less now, but it's largely an older congregation. And what I had to, and I was just sort of confused. It's like, what's going on here? And what I realized, and it took a lot of deep listening, and we all sort of struggled through this together, was one of the things about All Saints, and it has just been one of the greatest gifts of this community, is it has been for so many people a place where people who have been damaged by evangelicalism, particularly fundamentalist evangelicalism, who really thought that there was no room in any church for them, because these churches were just hateful to them as who they were, particularly lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer persons, where they have found a home at All Saints and realized, oh, I can be a trans person and be at All Saints. Oh, I can be a Buddhist and be at All Saints. I can be all these things. And the language, even the word of Jesus, has been weaponized against so many of them.
Right.
And I did not come wonderfully from like I've never been traumatized in that way. First as sort of a cishet straight white guy, I don't have a lot of trauma that comes from social location at all in my life. But also, it just was like I was never involved with conservative evangelicalism. It wasn't a part of my story. So I didn't have any sort of deprogramming from that to do. And what happened was I finally had to realize, oh, there's a disconnect here between what I'm in. It's an intent impact thing, but what I believe I'm saying and what a certain group in the congregation was hearing.
Yes.
And we had to get to know each other. And that part of it was they didn't know me and I didn't know them. And so we had to spend a couple of years just getting to know each other. The values are something that is incarnate in this community already. So my job isn't to impose my values on this community. My job is to gather us all around the same table, and to have us tell stories. And from that process, the congregation came up with, well, we are about radical inclusion, courageous justice, joyful spirituality, and ethical stewardship. Well, that's your operative definition of who Jesus is.
Yes.
And so that's what's at the center of the community. And those are values that I believe Christ expresses, but they aren't exclusively Christian values. We trust that we are equipped in every situation. What we need is here. We have the wisdom already in this community to meet every challenge. And the trick is the world lies to us. And the model of capitalism is based on believing that you don't have everything you need.
Right.
And that you need to buy this, or that you need to work harder to be worth. It's like, no. Beloved community means you've got it, you're beloved, you have everything you need just being who you are as you were created.
Totally. It's so good to be countercultural in that, and to remind people of that.
For us to be countercultural as Christians, it's really interesting, because we see all this in Christian nationalism, of this sort of whole idea of, well, this is, the greatness of America is that we're a Christian nation. And it's all this theology of empire, which is the exact opposite of Jesus. But that's what that's become. And so, our challenge is to say, there's a lot of that stuff that's actually really attractive. There's a pastor who used to be here at Pasadena Nazarene Church, Tara Beth Leach. And she introduced me to a phrase that I'd never heard of, but which I love. And she called it the ABCs of empire: attendance, buildings, and cash. And it's what, and I will say, what I am held responsible for, what I am rated about in my job, what people pay attention to, even at All Saints Church, is attendance, buildings, and cash. How is our worship attendance? How are the facilities looking? What's our budget? And it's like, none of that has anything to do with, are we following Jesus?
Right. And you forget that the budget is a moral document, right? Like
it's a moral document.
How do you remind people that, no, this isn't supposed to be that we're supposed to be in the black always? Like, it's about, are we living in the way that we should be living? And are we putting that green energy behind the things that we want to grow?
Right. And Jesus actually says, give it all away to the poor and come and follow me. He actually says that. And like people are like, well, no, he means be willing to do this and metaphor. It's like, actually, no, he really did say, just give it all away. And I'm not doing that. You know, it's like Bono. It's like, don't believe in riches, but you should see where I live.
Right.
And it's just, but I think we need to hold ourselves to that standard, not out of shame, but to say that's actually a statement of liberation. You know, when Jesus told, you know, the rich young ruler, you know, you lack one thing, go give everything you have to the poor and come and follow me. What Jesus was saying is that's how you're going to be free. Because all that stuff that you own and all your wealth, it is holding you prisoner. And what the problem is trying to live that in a society that is a multi-millennia failed experiment in community. Like we had a reading this past Sunday from the Acts of the Apostles where they talked about the early church, and they said in the early church, everyone held all possessions in common and gave to each as they had need. Well, the reason that we don't want to give everything up, besides the fact that we really like our stuff, is that, well, we see people who have nothing and they live on the street. And life is really hard and we discard and dispose them.
Yeah.
And so that's where that idea, but that's a failure of community. If we were functioning as beloved community, there would be no need for personal property ownership. And yet we have an economic system that is entirely based on personal property rights, and a constitution of this country that's entirely based on personal property rights.
I love that. Yeah, no, I just think like, you know, there's so many, it's like, you know, there's stories about the rabbis that just like curse. Like there's this one story of this rabbi in the Talmud who goes over to Rome, and then he sees Rome and he just curses Rome. And why? Because he says that he sees that in the evenings when the cold air hits the columns in Rome, they put these thick mats, these thick carpets around the columns so they won't crack. And in the desert heat, when the heat waves come in the summer, they put these thick carpets around these columns, these marble columns, so they don't crack. But then every day he sees a poor person lying on a straw mat right next to it. And he's like cursing, like, how do you treat people this way, right? This is where we can easily head. And unfortunately in America, we really have gotten there with CEOs making thousands of times their lowest worker. We need to reframe things. Like we've gotten so lost in what is actually valuable that, you know, we like, so that's why I love speaking with you.
And as a community, we need to help each other grow in that direction. And I think you're exactly right about how we've become, I mean, for the length of whatever it is we call Western civilization, which has generally been a capitalist model, we have these modes of thinking that are so ingrained in us that it doesn't even occur to us that there could be a different way of looking at things. And I was at St. Louis, had this big sort of 200th birthday party several years ago, and I was still living there. And I was sort of at the big celebration dinner, and they had representatives from some of the indigenous peoples who were still in the area, but who once were more numerous in the area. And I was seated next to one of these people, and I wish I could remember his name and his tribe, but I can't. But we started having a conversation, and frankly, I was approaching it from sort of a very sort of typical American liberal sort of place, of sort of like, yeah, you know, we took your land and we need to talk about this and what reparations look like. And frankly, probably acting as much out of my own guilt as anything else being set next to this person. And he just was listening so patiently to me. And then he said, this is really where you all get it wrong, and you get it wrong all the time. He's like, you keep talking about how you stole our land and you need to pay us back for our land. It was never our land, and it's not your land now. It's just the land. And it's like, that's what you need to recognize. It's like this is not about ownership. And for us, it never was. It's like, we never thought that you stole our land.
Right.
And I'm not saying that all indigenous peoples feel this. I was like, this is what this one person said. And I was just sort of like, yeah, and it has shifted my whole mindset.
Right.
And like one of the things we're doing right now, and I believe in part of what our faith tradition, is about you do something small as a sign of a whole. As Episcopalians, we believe in what's called a sacramental rite of reconciliation that's got 5 steps. It starts with self-examination, then moves to confession, repentance and reparation, amendment of life, and then absolution, which is the declaration of right relationship. In practice, we usually do no self-examination. We do a loud and very surface confession. We skip over reparation, and usually amendment of life, and we expect to jump right to absolution, and which is like, oh yeah, I screwed up, I'm really sorry, forgive me. It's like, no. That first step of self-examination is really that deep listening piece, and it's telling the whole story. So we've started 2 groups here, and we're saying we're going to take 2 discrete things. The first is the stained glass windows in our church, which are exclusively white in iconography, and the main one, and you've been there, that is in the apse. It is the main focal point of worship. It's a tobacco baroness.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's actually another one just like it in a church in New Jersey. And it was someone, because this is what you did back then, is you wanted a memorial of you and your children. And so you gave a lot of money to the church, and you had your face and your children's faces in these stained glass windows. So the money for that window did come from, wealth that was generated by torturing labor out of, stolen Black bodies. And so we've formed a group, and we're sort of saying, we're going to tell the whole story of these stained glass windows, including what has been the impact on how we think about God and Christ and how we think about leadership to when we look around our worship space to only see white faces. Not just what has been our impact on people of color, although that's a huge part of it. What's been the impact of us and white people of accepting the leadership and the gifts of people of color? And then the second one is really on the land that we live on. And we're going to listen deeply to members of the Gabrielino Tongva tribe and others who have lived here. We're going to hear the stories. And someone asked me the question. They said, well, what if at the end of this process, and we've told the story, the question comes up in terms of what repentance reparation looks like, of we need to return this land to people who were pushed off it. And then I said, then we need to seriously look at whether we're capable of doing that. And we need to, and if we really say, no, we can't do that. If we have that moment of the rich young ruler, who went away sorrowful because he had many possessions, then we need to not let fear of that being what is demanded of us keep us from actually allowing it to be demanded of us and being honest about what we can do. And also be willing to not just jump to that space.
Right.
And, I don't want to assume what members of this tribal community are going to say is the same thing I heard at that dinner.
Right.
What I do want to, I'm not assuming anything. Well, all we're going to do now is listen.
Right.
And tell the story, and try to be aware when we are trapped in these Western capitalistic frameworks that convince us that, it's all about attendance, buildings, and cash. Yeah.
That's where that connection comes back, right? That like showing up for community and showing up for each other.
Yeah. And what we need to remember is that it's always the person who stands up and does the courageous thing out of love.
Yeah.
That actually, no matter what happens to them in the short term, is Jesus led with love, ended up nailed to a cross and executed by the state. And whether or not you believe in the resurrection as a historical event or just the truth of the poetry of it, which frankly, I don't care. It's still the truth.
The truth.
It's the invincibility of whether you lead. When you lead with love, even if you die, you win. Because, it's Gandhi saying, you can beat me, you can do all this, and then you will have my broken body, but you will not have my obedience.
Totally.
Like, you lead with love, you're invincible.
Totally.
Which is why the forces are so afraid of love.
I wanted to ask you a little bit also about your prison chaplaincy, because I know that you go to the prisons often.
First is just sort of a recognition that Jesus was a prisoner of the state and was executed by the state. And that in this country, the people who are incarcerated are much more likely to be poor, are much more likely to be Black or brown, are much more likely to be the marginalized among whom Jesus numbered himself and among whom Jesus hung out. And so that's part of why I say, when I, go to Twin Towers or Men's Central Jail, which is the primary places I've gone, and I haven't been for more than a year because of the pandemic. I get to go back in August. Is like, I'm going to meet and to listen and talk and pray with Jesus. And so a couple things about that. First is, All Saints is a wonderful community and we have a certain amount of diversity to us. And we tend to skew sort of white and wealthier. And it would be very easy for me as rector of All Saints Church, particularly, as a mainline church that is held accountable to attendance, buildings, and cash, to spend all my time and energy on people who could write big checks, and with other parishioners, and also, and all wonderful people, all phenomenal people.
Yeah.
And yet one of the challenges of living our faith in this culture is that we are so economically segregated, and the gap between rich and poor is so great. And frankly, the people who are in jail especially when you're talking about jail rather than prison, you're talking about people who the only reason they're in there is because they can't afford bail. There are not wealthy people in jail.
Right.
There just aren't.
Yeah.
It's people who cannot afford the representation that someone like me, could afford. And so if I'm going to sit, the vestry is our governing body, if I'm going to sit at the vestry table of All Saints Church, I need to be in continual relationship with those among us who live on the margins of society, and our siblings in incarceration are among those most marginalized. And really where this came from was, and you heard me, like you mentioned Thistle Farms before, and just a dear, dear friend, and really feels like a sister to me, Becca Stevens, who is an Episcopal priest, founded this community in Nashville called Magdalene at the time. It's grown into something called Thistle Farms. It's a 2-year residential community for women who are survivors of child rape and other sexual molestation, drug abuse, prostitution, and life on the street. And the average age of the women in this program of first being molested or raped is age 6. They first started using hard drugs age 10, 11, 12, and then were on the streets being sold or selling themselves 13, 14, 15. That's the average age, which means as much below as in higher. And by the time, they ended up in Thistle Farms, they have 50, 100, 200 arrests on their record because the way we criminalize the women in prostitution and sex work, not the men.
Right.
And so, whenever a DA or someone would need to feel like they're being tough on crime, or a police chief, they do a sweep, arrest a woman, give them a slap on the wrist, they go to jail, then they're back out on the street. And of course, the only way they can make money is to do this and to feed the drug addiction and all that. Anyway, Thistle Farms is this amazing program that it really is the power of love without judgment and extravagant love. And so women come into the program and they get everything they need. And it's sort of this combination of Benedictine spirituality and the best of evidence-based social work. And 78% of the women a year after the program are clean and sober. And that's from people who have been on crack and meth and heroin. It's unheard of. And then it's now this $40 million industry because they realized that, women were getting clean and sober and getting their kids back and all this stuff, but then no one would hire them because they have these criminal records. And so they said, we got to create our own jobs. And so now it's this, I'm part of the Global Advisory Network, which is really looking at women's cooperatives are springing up all over the world and how can we help link them together. And what we're finding is, out of the sort of trauma healing model, is women are leading and creating in ways that are so incredible that are not, they really view, hierarchies of support rather than hierarchies of domination. Anyway, where this relates to prison chaplaincy is like wherever I am, I invite Becca to come in and she always brings some of the women at Thistle Farms with her. And so we do this thing in the Episcopal Church when a new rector comes into a place and it's way too much like a coronation. And so we try to call it a celebration of new ministry. And I've had Becca come in and preach. And she gave me a list in that sermon And I've got it right here. And it's like Becca's 7 things to do as rector of All Saints Church. And I'll just read them to you.
I want to hear it.
I live by these.
I remember reading them when you put them on Facebook too, but I want to hear them again. And I would love for our listeners to hear this too. It's so good.
And they keep growing in meaning. So she did this 4 years ago, and it just is. And so the first is practice the one sacrament of the church with its 7 prisms, which is healing. Everything's about healing. 2, and I'm feeling this one now. Grieve with abandonment. There is more to grieve as we get older, and it becomes deeper and richer. 3, I'm still trying to figure this one out. Transform longing into solitude as you contemplate. And I still have not figured out what that means, and I'm still trying to sit with that one. And I think I've got some meaning to find in that. 4th, commit to the humility of the priesthood and keep taking out the trash and washing dishes. 5th, and I really think the your here is plural for us as a community, give heed to your dreams that want to carry you to a new vision. And so it's not just your dreams, but your dreams have this desire to carry you to a whole new vision of being. And then the 6th was this: know the closest prison and visit it and make sure you sign up as a volunteer next week. And I did that. I went out and it's like, I called Dennis Gibbs over at our prison ministry in the diocese. It's like, okay, I need to do this. And I started the process. And then the last one, which we're working on it, is build a shelter like you might build a cathedral. And again, it's that sort of whole idea of what is extravagant love. And we, when the pandemic started, everything shut down. And at one point we had 50 to 60 people living on campus because there was nowhere else for them to go. And we've transformed that with the help of wonderful people at Union Station Homeless Services to a program called Safe Haven, where we have 12 people. They have lockers. They're all connected to a housing navigator. When people find housing, we stay connected with them, and then we bring someone else new in. And we're getting other faith communities to do this. And this came out of COVID when shelters could only operate on 20% capacity. Now, this is really good. And the whole idea is also community-based, which is these are not people that we as All Saints are serving. We are all part of All Saints community. And part of that means we have to reckon with the fact that we permit some people in our community to be homeless, and others like me, we would never permit to be homeless. And so what's that about? And people are still sleeping on the ground at night. This is not building a shelter like you would a cathedral.
Right.
It's a first step. And so, which is why I keep looking at that one and say, because really when you build shelters as if they're cathedrals, that actually means there's no such thing as shelters anymore.
Right.
Is that everyone is housed with extravagant love. And so it's like, okay, we're on, we've put our foot on that road and we got a ways to go.
And that distinction between human beings and God is diminished, right? Like if you honor reverently God in a cathedral, then you're going to honor the God that is the person housing, and you're going to be reverential toward them and honoring and uplifting as well. Beautiful. It's so wonderful to hear so much about all that you're doing. And I wondered where can people find you? Can you share with us a little bit about where to find you?
Well, our website is allsaints-pas.org, allsaints-pas.org. So that's where you find All Saints. We're in Pasadena, right across from City Hall is our physical location at 132 North Euclid. And
Farms also?
At Thistle Farms, go to thistlefarms.org. That's thistlefarms.org. The founder is Becca Stevens. The prison ministry I'm involved in is called PRISM, PRISM. It's called PRISM Restorative Justice. And really what it's about is it's more than just prison chaplaincy. It really is about prison abolition. And frankly, it's becoming, as I really believe in, it's becoming about police abolition too, which I'm a strong believer in, because we can do better and we have to do better. Right. And so, find me in any of those places.
I'm so grateful for your time today, and thank you so much for your stunning vision, sharing your stunning vision. I love that vision, the vision that you share about leadership for all and creating that world that it should be, and working toward that tension between working toward the world that we want it to be and living in reality. I think people forget, right? There's that saying that clergy always gives the sermon that we need to hear for ourselves. So,
Oh man, is that true?
When you were talking about, like, am I scolding? I'm not scolding. I'm just like, I'm also like thinking about, where do I live and how do I assert my white privilege, and when do I, what do I do with that? So that's beautiful. I think, I really appreciate that, you shared your vision for that, and the tension between that and just what it means to be a human being right now on the face of the earth, and thinking about these things and keeping that sacred at the center. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. If you have someone that you'd like to recommend that we host on the show, please contact us at keepingitsacred.com. There you can sign up for our newsletter and stay up to date with all that we're programming, including opportunities to study together and more. Thanks everyone for keeping it sacred. Be well.